GCSE English Language, Paper 2, Questions 2 and 4. Snow. Inserts. Source A, 20th Century Non-Fiction, The Death Zone, by Matt Dickinson, an extract from a book printed in 1997. Source B, 19th Century Literary Non-Fiction, London Snow, an extract from a diary written by Arthur Munby, published in 1867. Credit to stewdoku.com for the model answers, which I have altered slightly. Source A. British climber Matt Dickinson, together with his team, is attempting to scale Mount Everest. At base camp, 1,000 feet below them, his colleague, Audrey Salkeld, is the first to see the approaching storm. The Death Zone. At 5,360 metres, base camp is a cheerless place at the best of times. But once the sun has dipped beneath the surrounding ridges, it is like living in a freezer. Shivering with the cold, Salkeld left the mess tent and walked across the ice of the Khumbu Glacier towards her tent to find some extra clothing. Glancing into the sky to the south, she became one of the first people, and probably the very first, to see what was sweeping up from the lower valleys of the Himalayas towards Everest. It was a sight which fixed her to the spot, all thoughts of seeking out a few more layers of clothing momentarily forgotten. Sudden squalls are common in the afternoon on Everest, but Salkeld had never seen anything like this before. She later described it as looking like a tyre dump fire, great billowing lilac clouds racing up from the south. She called out other members of the team from our tents, and they stood watching in awe as the apocalyptic vision crept silently and swiftly towards them. At speeds touching 80 to 100 kilometres an hour, the storm whipped into the camp just minutes later, plunging the temperature down by 10 to 15 degrees in as many seconds, ripping into the tents in a blinding fury of driving snow. The storm swept up the southern flanks of Everest, engulfing the ice-clad slopes effortlessly in a swirling mantle of hurricane-force winds. Within minutes it had the northern side in its grip, and then it rose to take the summit. The mightiest mountain in the world disappeared from view as the storm took control. If Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction, and Nemesis, the Greek goddess of retribution, had joined forces, they could not have done a better job of devastation than nature itself did on that day. The timing was uncanny, as bad as it was possible to be. If the storm had struck in winter, then no one would have been hurt, but as chance would have it, the tempest arrived on the busiest day of the Everest calendar, right in the middle of the pre-monsoon climbing season. Our expedition, a British attempt on the north face via the northeast ridge, was at Camp 3 when the storm thundered in. We immediately knew that this was something far more dangerous than any other storm that had hit us in the 8 weeks we'd been there. The temperature fell to 10 degrees below freezing, then 20, then 30 degrees below. The wind became a constant bullying force, pulling guy ropes from the glacier ice, tumbling fully laden equipment barrels into crevasses, and demolishing our canvas mess tent with frightening ease. The dome tents, built to withstand hurricane-force winds, creaked and groaned under the beating, distorted into shapes they were never designed for, and straining the tent poles to their limits. We could have been in the Antarctic on the Greenland ice cap, or at the North Pole, so complete was the blanket of driving snow which obscured every feature around us. Not a single landmark, not even the huge North Ridge, was visible through the raging whiteout of the blizzard. Through the white wall of snow, rising across the tempestuous roar of the wind across the glacier, was another sound, a sinister howl which told of even greater powers at play in the altitudes above us. The scream of the storm as it whirled across the north face 8,000 metres and above. There, in the death zone, more than 30 climbers were fighting for their lives. On the northern side, 3 Indian climbers were stranded, exhausted, and with their oxygen supplies running out, high on the northeast ridge. On the southern side, 2 commercial expeditions were strung out between the South Col and the summit. The night that faced them was a night from hell. By the end of the following day, the 3 Indian climbers on the north side and 5 of the climbers on the south were dead. The total of 8 fatalities made this the greatest loss of life in any 24-hour period on the peak. Source B. Arthur Mumby kept a diary in the 1800s, and in these extracts taken from January 1867, he describes London in the snow. London snow. Wednesday the 2nd of January. Since midnight, snow had silently fallen to the depth of 6 to 8 inches. By breakfast time, it was all over except a slight flaky dropping, and the day was calm and very cold. Nothing could be more beautiful, no change more complete and charming. The trees around the fountain near Garden Court were loaded with snow, an exquisite tracery of white branches relieved against the dark red house fronts. But in the streets the transformation was the greatest. All traffic, except afoot, was stopped. No cabs, no omnibuses, no wagons. The snow lay in heaps in the road. Men were scraping and shovelling the footways, and people in thick coats and wrappers stepped noiselessly along. The Strand was as quiet and empty as a village street at nightfall. Even the foot passengers were far fewer than usual. Here in the heart of London and at midday there was absolute cleanliness and brightness, absolute silence, instead of the roar and rush of wheels, the selfish hurry, the dirt and the cloudy fog. We had the loveliness and utter purity of new-fallen snow. It fell without force or sound, and all things huge and hasty and noisy were paralysed in a moment. I walked along, enjoying the wondrous, lovely scene, the long perspective of houses, all grown picturesque and antique, their gable roofs white against a clear sky, and everything overhanging joint and beam in their outline picked out in brilliant white, and beneath them the tumbled and peopleless pavement of snow. It was like the quaint, still London of old. One might have been in arm with Mr. Pepys, or even Mr. W. Shakespeare. And this state of things lasted all day. There were many crossing sweepers about. I noticed one near St. Clement Danes, a girl of 17 or so in a ragged but warm shawl, and a bit of an old bonnet, whose dark rough hair was covered with snow and hung in a tangled white mass like the foam of a waterfall over her brown bonny face, as she stood with her broom under her arm, stamping and blowing her fingers. Friday the 4th of January. The cold out of doors at 10 this morning was more intense, to my apprehension, than I ever remember. My beard froze, and the nape of my neck and my heart seemed paralysed. A headache came on, and by the end of the short walk from here to Whitehall I was almost helpless. At 4 p.m. I walked westward, thinking to call on my friends, the Thackerays. The Horse Guards Parade and the Mall were one sheet of snow, with paths trodden but not swept. A thick brown fog brooded over it, deepening the twilight, and muffled spectral figures hurried to and fro across the slippery ground. In Victoria Street, a girl begged of me, a ragged, tall girl of 19, by name Caroline Randall, by trade an ironer, who has no home, who slept last night on a step in a sheltered corner and felt cold as a frog, she said. Questions. Section A, reading. Answer all questions in this section. You're advised to spend about 45 minutes on this section. Question 2. You need to refer to source A and source B for this question. The effects of the weather on people in both sources are very different. Use details from both sources to write a summary of the different ways people are affected by the weather. 8 marks. Text A. Which words show you the effects on the people in this text? So in text A, we're looking for effects of the weather on people. This is the last paragraph of text A, and as you can see, the writer uses the phrase the death zone, which gives you a strong clue about what happened. 30 climbers were fighting for their lives. They were stranded and exhausted. It was a night from hell. A lot were dead, another word for fatalities, and there was great loss of life. So those last three phrases all mean the same thing. So that was the effect of that storm on the mountain on the people. What were the effects of the weather on people in text B? Although this isn't the best paragraph to look at the effects of the weather on people, it does have some information you can use. So you can say that there's only a sheet of snow. So the effect of that is that you can walk through it. It's trodden but not swept. It's foggy and damp, which the writer can obviously feel, and people look like ghosts. They're spectral. The ground is slippery, which would affect you, and a girl who slept on a step all night says she's cold as a frog. And these effects are rather different from the deathly storm which occurred on the mountain in text A. So to summarise, in text A, it's called the death zone. 30 climbers were fighting for their lives. They were stranded and exhausted in a night from hell, and there was a lot of death. In text B, there was light snow which you could walk through. It was foggy, people looked like ghosts, the ground was slippery, and if you slept out all night you would feel as cold as a frog. Can you summarise the effects of the weather on people in a short phrase? So my summary of the effects of the weather on people would be that in text A, the weather is fatally dangerous, perilous, devastating and traumatic. In text B, the weather is slightly inconvenient, mildly dangerous, damp and a bit confusing. Question 2, model answer. For question 2, the 8 marks mean you should write 2 paragraphs, one on each text, summarising clearly the answers to the question written by each author, in this case the effect of the weather on people. In source A, the weather is shown to affect people very severely and causes death. For example, the greatest loss of life on the peak. This shows that the storm in source A was so severe that it actually caused fatalities. It also shows the overwhelming effect that it had physically on the people. The phrase, "not a single landmark," was visible through the raging whiteout, shows the disorientation caused by the weather. The fact that experienced climbers were so confused and lost by the storm shows that the weather can have a serious effect on anyone. We know that some of the climbers who died were experienced, or at least prepared, as they were on commercial expeditions. This shows that nature, in the form of weather, can still have severe consequences to those who are trying to be prepared. In source B, the weather is shown to have a much less serious effect on people. For instance, enjoying the wondrous scene shows that the weather has actually been appreciated by some people and is shown to have positive effects. Furthermore, the effects of the weather are much more trivial and much less harmful than in source A. The phrase, "my beard froze," summarises the differences in the effects of the weather. Having a frozen beard will not cause any long-term problems and will soon be gone again. Also, this is in no way life-threatening and is more of a minor problem. The phrase, "as cold as a frog," also emphasises how the effects of the weather in source B are negligible in comparison to the death and suffering in source A. Overall, the effects are very different in both sources, mostly a large change in severity. Let's put together an answer to question 2. Start by suggesting quotations about the effects of the weather on people in text A. Quotes for question 2, text A. Quotes for question 2, text B. We can write our answer to question 2 here. Question 4. For this question, you need to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. Compare how the writers convey their different perspectives on the extreme weather conditions. In your answer, you could compare their different perspectives on the extreme weather conditions, compare the methods the writers use to convey their different perspectives, support your response with references to both texts. 16 marks. Which are the important parts of this question? The important parts of this question are the words how and different perspectives on the extreme weather. So you need to be making sure that, as circled below, you're using references or quotes from your text to show the methods which the writer is using. You can also name techniques if you wish, but that's actually a speciality of question 3. But the important thing is you pick good quotations and show that you understand what the writer is saying to answer the question. What are the different perspectives? For texts A and B, you can see the different perspectives laid out quite clearly in the introductory paragraph at the top before the text actually starts and the first paragraph. So for text A, the important perspectives are that the writer is attempting to scale Mount Everest. There's a storm coming and it's really, really cold before the situation gets even worse. What's the perspective in text B? In text B, we're in Victorian London in the snow. There's a 6 or 8 inch depth of snow on the ground which has fallen silently. It's calm, it's beautiful, and the writer is charmed by it. Their perspectives are very different. How? The writer of text A relates his attempt to climb the highest mountain in the world, Mount Everest. There's a storm coming, it's freezing cold, and he's shocked at the devastating events. The writer of text B describes a cold and snowy day in Victorian London, which he perceives as beautiful, slightly inconvenient, but not at all dangerous, and he's charmed by it. Question 4, model answer. For question 4, the 16 marks mean you should write 3 to 4 paragraphs stating clearly the different perspectives and main points made by each author, and then summarising clearly the differences or similarities to each other written by each author. In this case, differences between the experience of fatalities on Everest and mild peril, damp, cold and inconvenience in London. The depth of your insight, not the length of your answer, is how to get more marks. Think about implications and outside links, for example, religion. Firstly, Source A, The Death Zone, is a 20th century non-fiction account of an expedition to Mount Everest. The author vividly describes their experience of the storm he endures. He describes it as a night from hell for the climbers, implying that the storm was not only immensely powerful and intimidating, but also related to faith, sin, and God. The image of hell indicates that the climbers experienced some kind of punishment, such as the power of the storm. It also adds to the implication that the storm acted as some form of vengeance by the gods to humanity for some grievous sin. It's described as an apocalyptic vision, and indeed for the climbers it does pose a mortal threat. The storm isolates and terrifies each individual climber, every one of them fighting for their lives. Source B is a 19th century diary entry by one Arthur Munby, who has a much more sedentary life than the author of Source A. This is shown in his sense of wonderment and romanticism of the snowfall he experiences in London. He holds a quaint view of the snow that influences his perspectives as he goes. He describes the snow experience as loveliness and utter purity, quite averse to the apocalyptic vision of Source A. This snowfall initially seems to have little effect on Munby, but he comes across homeless people in the cold and becomes quite disenchanted with the weather. He later describes it in a more pessimistic sense. My heart seemed paralysed, shows how he feels. The snow infringes upon his quality of life and appears to stop him functioning as best he could. Despite these apparent issues and annoyances, they remain mere temporary inconveniences in the face of such mortal challenges Dickinson and the climbers face. Naturally, Arthur Munby holds no experience of mountaineering, and therefore would not be subjected to these fatal events. For Dickinson, the storm attacks the climbers as a constant bullying force, implying deliberate intent, whereas Munby, by contrast, had his beard frozen, which is insignificant. Fatalities are the result of Everest's tempest, but, on the other hand, even those with little to no material shelter suffer relatively little in Text B. One such homeless girl claims to feel as cold as a frog. Arthur Munby portrays this person as a victim in his recount of the day, and he clearly pities her, but her struggles appear almost insincere compared to the godly, overpowering strength that the storm presents to the mountaineers as both an apocalyptic vision and the seemingly combined forces of various destructive gods. Let's put together an answer to question 4. Start by suggesting quotations about the effects of the weather on people in Text A. Quotes for question 4, Text A. Quotes for question 4, Text B. We can write our answer to question 4 here.